They said that ancestors never return lightly, that their presence is a warning no living soul should ignore. But last night I heard it myself, a slow, deliberate knock on my door. My heart froze, and the air grew heavy, thick with something I could not name. The sound repeated, steady, echoing in the silent house, and then a whisper followed, soft yet unmistakable. Name. It was my grandfather, though he had been dead for 20 years. I told myself it was a trick of the mind, the wind, something mundane. But when the rocking chair in the corner moved, just slightly without anyone touching it, I knew that the impossible had come calling. The shadows stretched unnaturally across the floor, flickering in the dim lantern light, and for the first time, I felt that the house itself was alive, watching me, waiting. Returning to the ancestral home had seemed like a harmless endeavor. I wanted to reconnect with my roots, face the stories of my childhood, and perhaps confront the fears I had dismissed in youth. The village lay at the edge of a dense forest, and the huts were lined with centuries of history, their walls steeped in secrets and old rituals. My childhood friend, Sephew, had begged me not to stay alone. He spoke of respect, fear, and the old ways, but I had laughed off his warnings. I thought I was too rational to be caught in superstition. That night, however, rationality was powerless. Every sound, every shadow, every whisper seemed to vibrate with intent, and I felt drawn into something far older than myself. The first disturbances were subtle. A soft creak of a floorboard here, a rustle through the thatched roof there. The wind seemed to speak, carrying words I almost recognized, fleeting and unintelligible. I tried to focus on ordinary explanations, but the air was thick with unease, and the rocking chair moved again, this time with more urgency. I could feel the pull of something ancient, the weight of generations pressing down on me, as if the walls themselves were remembering my grandfather's presence and demanding my attention. Outside, the forest loomed, dark and silent but alive. Its branches twisted and groaned, and the mist curled along the ground like living fingers, reaching closer to the village and the house where I stood frozen, unsure whether to run or confront what had returned. Sleep was impossible. Dreams carried me to the baobab tree at the forest's edge, where my grandfather appeared, silent and sorrowful, pointing toward the darkness. His lips moved, but no sound came. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, with a faint scent of his old cologne lingering in the room. At times, I thought I glimpsed him in the shadows, a figure faintly glowing with a bluish mist, drifting at the edge of my vision before vanishing like smoke. Each night, the knocks grew louder, more insistent, demanding recognition, and I realized that the warnings my family had whispered to me for years were not stories. They were instructions. I could feel the line of my ancestors watching through him, their silent eyes piercing the veil between the living and the dead, and I understood that my disbelief had awakened something that would not let me go easily. The village itself seemed complicit in the tension. Lanterns flickered, casting dancing shadows that morphed into shapes too human to ignore. Even the air seemed alive, carrying faint chants from the distant sacred grounds, though no one was performing rituals. At times, I thought the walls breathed along with me, inhaling fear, exhaling anticipation. Outside, the forest whispered, and shadows moved between the trees as though guided by an unseen hand. I felt a pull toward the threshold of the hut, as if some force was urging me to step beyond safety into the unknown. The knock came again, deliberate and slow, punctuated by a soft dragging sound across the floorboards, and I realized that ignoring it was no longer an option. Something was calling me, and I had no choice but to answer. I could no longer ignore the pull toward the forest. Each night, the knocking grew more insistent, echoing through the hut, vibrating through the floorboards, as if it sought to awaken something long buried. The air around me thickened, carrying faint scents of earth, incense, and something older, sharper, almost metallic. Shadows outside the window twisted unnaturally, stretching toward me as if beckoning. I wanted to stay hidden, to lock myself away and pretend it was all a dream, but the moment I stepped toward the door, I felt it, an invisible weight pressing against my chest, urging me forward. The forest awaited, whispering my name in voices that were both familiar and terrifying. My grandfather was there, I knew it, somewhere beyond the edge of the village, and he was waiting for me to come. The first steps into the forest were hesitant. Mist clung to the ground, curling around my ankles like ghostly hands, and the trees towered above, ancient and silent, their twisted branches forming shapes that my mind could not entirely comprehend. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch, yet I pressed forward, driven by fear, curiosity, and the inescapable knowledge that my grandfather's presence demanded acknowledgement. A faint glow flickered between the trunks, shifting like a living thing, and I caught glimpses of a figure. Tall, frail, wreathed in mist, with eyes that glimmered like embers. Froze. It was him. My grandfather, or at least the spirit that carried his essence, waiting for me to prove that I remembered the lineage, the promises, the old rites. As I ventured deeper, the whispers became clearer, forming words in the air that I could almost hear. Remember, protect, honor, they said, but the rhythm was broken, as if the forest itself struggled to carry messages from the beyond. Shadows moved in tandem with me, never leaving, always just beyond the corner of my vision. I could feel them studying me, testing me, and at times I thought I saw shapes of other ancestors standing silently among the trees, their faces partially hidden, their gaze heavy and judging. The feeling of being watched was suffocating, yet I could not turn back. Somewhere in this darkness was the truth, the reason my grandfather had returned, and I had to see it, or risk losing more than my courage. Then came the sounds, soft at first like distant drums, irregular and haunting. Each beat seemed to pulse through the ground beneath me, through my bones, through my heart. The whispers intertwined with the drumming, forming an eerie rhythm that guided me deeper into the forest. The mist thickened, blurring shapes, turning familiar trees into grotesque, twisting forms. I thought I saw a figure move ahead of me, sometimes faint, sometimes more defined, but every time I looked directly, it vanished. I realized with growing dread that the spirit had the power to manipulate what I saw, to toy with my mind, and I questioned my own sanity as the forest itself seemed to breathe, exhale, and pulse in time with a haunting rhythm. I stopped at a clearing where a stone shrine, worn and moss-covered, emerged through the mist. Symbols carved long ago glimmered faintly in the spectral light, and the air was thick with a presence that made my chest tighten and my vision narrow. There he stood, my grandfather's spirit, now fully visible, pale and almost ethereal, with tattered robes that seemed to drift and ripple though no wind moved them. His eyes held a sorrow so deep that it pulled at my very soul. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to beg him to leave me be, but words failed me. Instead, a cold wind rose from the ground, swirling around me, and I felt his presence pressing against my chest, urging me to understand, to accept, to obey the line of ancestors I had neglected. Fear and awe warred within me as I realized that this was not just a visitation, it was a reckoning. As I stood frozen, shadows began to coalesce at the edge of the clearing. Figures emerged, other spirits, faintly glowing, silent yet intent. They moved closer, circling me like a predator encircling its prey, yet their eyes held something more than malice. They were testing me, measuring my courage, my respect for the old ways. I could hear fragments of their voices, whispers in tongues I only partially understood. Blood, promise, line, broken, restore, or pay. My heart pounded so violently that I thought it might burst. I knew then that my grandfather had not returned merely to haunt me. He had come to remind me, to warn me, and perhaps to claim justice for the negligence of our ancestors. The forest seemed alive, the mist forming shapes that I could not comprehend, and I felt the weight of centuries pressing down, demanding that I face what I had ignored for so long. The knocking returned, echoing from the village, though I was deep within the forest. It was slow, deliberate, unyielding, and somehow connected to the presence here. My grandfather spoke, not with words but with impressions that filled my mind. You have ignored the warnings. You have forgotten the line. Tonight you will remember. My body trembled, and yet I stepped forward, drawn by a mixture of fear and obligation. The spirits began to move closer, and I could feel the cold brushing against my skin, the soft whisper of robes against the mist, the subtle scent of old earth and something metallic, sharp, and impossible to identify. I realized that I was standing on a threshold, not just between the living and the dead, but between safety and something far darker. Suddenly, the forest fell silent. The whispers stopped. The drums ceased. Even the mist seemed to pause, waiting. My grandfather's figure glowed faintly in the moonlight that filtered through the trees. He extended a hand toward me, not threatening but insistent, commanding attention. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breath caught in my throat. The weight of generations pressed down on me, and I understood with terrifying clarity that this night would change everything. I had been summoned, tested, and now faced the reckoning I had ignored for too long. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet my feet remained rooted, as if the very ground was holding me there to witness, to understand, to survive, or perhaps not. Questions flooded my mind as I stared at him. What had I failed to honor? What mistake of the ancestors demanded this? Could I survive the night, or would I be claimed like those who had forgotten before me? The shadows moved again, closer now, circling the clearing, watching, waiting for a sign, and the mist thickened, curling around my legs like cold fingers. The chill penetrated to my bones, yet a strange clarity settled in my mind. I understood that I could not turn back, could not flee, and could not deny the presence that had returned for a purpose. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath, and I knew that the true test, the confrontation, the revelation, was only beginning. I stepped forward into the heart of the clearing, every sense screaming with fear and anticipation. The mist clung to me like a living thing, swirling around my legs and brushing against my face, carrying whispers that echoed from centuries past. My grandfather's figure stood before me, solid yet spectral, eyes glowing faintly in the pale moonlight. I wanted to speak, to ask why, to plead, but no words came. Instead, the forest seemed to lean closer, ancient trees bending as though listening, shadows lengthening and twisting to mirror the tension between the living and the dead. I realized that I had crossed a threshold, between life and the spirits, past and present, the safety I had known and the reckoning that had been waiting for me my entire life. He raised a hand slowly, and the air itself seemed to pulse with his presence. You have ignored the line, forgotten the rites, dismissed the warnings. I felt him say, not in words, but in the chilling weight that pressed on my chest. Now the ancestors demand balance. The surrounding shadows shivered and twisted, taking on shapes that made my stomach churn. Faces of those who had failed before me, spectral eyes watching, waiting. The mist thickened, and faint blue lights drifted along the edges of the clearing, forming symbols in the air that I could not comprehend, though they radiated power older than memory. My pulse raced, yet I could not move, rooted by the gravity of his gaze and the undeniable pull of ancestral law. I knew then what I had feared. My grandfather had returned not as a benevolent spirit, but as a guardian of the lineage, enforcing the rules I had disregarded. He stepped closer, and the temperature dropped sharply, coldness piercing through my clothes into my bones. The forest seemed to hold its breath as I realized that to defy him was to defy generations, and to fail was unthinkable. The ground beneath me shifted slightly, not visibly, but in the subtle vibration of fear that ran through every nerve. I wanted to flee, yet I understood that this confrontation could not be avoided. The line had to be remembered, or its consequences would be far worse than mere fear. Then I felt the presence of others. Shadows emerged from the forest, figures barely visible, yet unmistakably human in form. Ancestors, guardians, spirits bound to the earth, circling me silently. They whispered fragments I could barely comprehend. Blood, promise, remember, restore, or pay. Their collective energy pressed down, testing my resolve. I realized that the night was no longer merely about my grandfather, but about me, my connection to the lineage, and whether I could uphold the ancient covenant that had been forgotten. My breath caught, my legs trembled, and yet I stepped forward, drawn by an instinct older than my own fear. The mist thickened further, swirling into the shape of my grandfather's younger self, the man I had known in childhood before death claimed him. His eyes glimmered with sorrow and purpose, and I understood that he was not only a warning, but a guide, offering a chance to make amends. The shadows reacted to his presence, forming barriers and channels, shaping the forest into a cathedral of the dead. I could feel their judgment, their expectation, and the weight of countless generations. My heart pounded, yet clarity began to form amidst the terror. I knew that to survive, to honor the line, I had to follow the path he indicated. He extended a hand toward the shrine, and I approached slowly, the mist swirling around my feet, the whispers rising into an almost tangible chant. Symbols glimmered faintly on the stones, ancient carvings that spoke of protection, punishment, and reconciliation. I reached out to touch them, and a shock ran through my body. Not painful, but electrifying, awakening memories I had never consciously known. Images flashed before my eyes. Past ceremonies, ancestors gathered in shadow and flame, rites performed and forgotten, the promise of protection ignored. The forest seemed to hum in response, a vibration that resonated through the air and into my very soul. Then came the choice. My grandfather's gaze met mine, imploring and stern. I could step back, retreat into the safety of disbelief, or I could acknowledge the line, perform the rites, and accept the consequence of remembering. I knew that failure meant being claimed, that refusal meant another broken link in the chain of our ancestors, that ignorance could not protect me. The air thickened, swirling violently as if the forest itself were impatient. Shadows twisted into faces I could not distinguish, voices blending into a chorus of accusation and warning. My hands shook, but I reached out, tracing the ancient carvings on the stones, whispering words that I felt in my bones more than heard. The energy surged, the mist convulsed, and the night held me in its breathless grip. And then I felt it, an immense pull, like being drawn into the very fabric of the forest, the shrine, the ancestral line. My grandfather's figure loomed larger, eyes glowing with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. The ground beneath me seemed to dissolve, replaced by the intangible weight of centuries, the responsibility of blood and promise. I felt my consciousness stretch, intertwine with the forest, the spirits, the past, and the future. I realized that survival was no longer about escaping, but about remembering, honoring, and accepting the consequences of neglect. The knock, the whispers, the shadows, all were part of the reckoning. And in that moment, I understood that some calls cannot be ignored, some presences cannot be denied, and some lessons are paid in ways the living cannot fully comprehend. Time lost meaning. The forest swirled in colors and shapes, ancient symbols glowing and fading, spirits watching and waiting. My grandfather stepped forward, hand extended one final time, and I felt the choice crystallize in my chest. I stepped into his grasp, and the world shifted violently. Cold mist wrapped around me, voices of ancestors rose in an overwhelming chorus, and I was pulled toward the shrine, toward the spectral embrace of the line I had forgotten. My body trembled, my heart threatened to shatter, and yet I felt peace, understanding, fear intertwined with awe, terror mingling with reverence. I was becoming part of the line, part of the covenant, a witness to the balance between life and death, the living and the spirits. The next morning, Sephew found the village quiet, the forest still and unbroken. My hut stood empty, the rocking chair unmoved, the door closed, yet a faint smell lingered. My grandfather's cologne, faint and impossibly real. Locals whispered of a young man who had ventured into the forest and disappeared, though some swore they saw shadows moving along the trees, and faint blue lights flickering in the mist. The drums of the village elders were silent, but the whispers continued in the wind. Warnings for those who came after, stories of a night when an ancestor knocked and the living were called to remember. And somewhere, deep in the forest, I understood that I was not gone, nor entirely present, but bound to the line forever, a reminder of the cost of forgetting, the weight of memory, and the terror of ancestral reckoning. Have you ever felt someone's presence when they should no longer be there? Felt a gaze that pierced through the world you know, demanding recognition of what was lost? If you have, then perhaps you understand what it means when a knock at your door carries the weight of centuries. Remember, some warnings are meant to be obeyed, some spirits cannot rest, and some nights are never meant to end quietly. If you want to hear more chilling tales from the depths of African folklore, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your own encounters in the comments. The night is long, the forest waits, and the ancestors are always listening.